On March the 2nd, 2026, less than 48 hours after Israel and the United States launched coordinated strikes on Iranian territory, Hezbollah fired 6 rockets into northern Israel. And in one of the most remarkable pieces of strategic communication to come out of this entire conflict, the commander of Israel's northern front did not describe that rocket barrage as an attack. He described it as a mistake. Major General Rafi Milo, chief of Israel's northern command, looked at reporters and said that Hezbollah had fallen into a strategic ambush. Not an escalation, not a provocation, an ambush. Hezbollah walked into a trap that had been set with extraordinary patience and precision, and the Israeli Air Force had been waiting behind the door. The wave of strikes that followed was not a response in any conventional sense of that word. It was the activation of a plan that Netanyahu had publicly described as having many surprises for the next phase of the war with Iran. A plan specifically designed to use Iran's own proxy network as a trigger for finishing what Israel had started years earlier with near-daily operations that the mainstream world was barely paying attention to. The ambush worked. And what Israeli fighter jets have done to Iran's proxy force since that moment, not just in Lebanon, but across Iraq, Syria, and the entire regional architecture that Tehran built over 4 decades and an estimated $1 trillion in investment, is a story that changes how every serious analyst thinks about proxy warfare, deterrence, and the actual strategic cost of keeping an empire of armed non-state actors alive when the people funding them start losing a war. We are going to break down the full picture across every front. What happened in Lebanon and why the phrase strategic ambush is exactly right, and exactly how it was described by the commander who executed it. What Israel and the United States have done to the proxy network in Iraq, where joint operations between American and Israeli forces, targeting the Popular Mobilization Forces, have now been joined by Saudi Arabia striking inside Iraqi territory for the first time in history, changing the regional coalition dynamic against Iran's proxy architecture in a way that Tehran specifically designed the entire axis of resistance to prevent. What is happening to the weapons smuggling corridor through Syria that Iran has used for a decade to rearm Hezbollah between rounds of fighting, and why the Alma Research Center's July 2026 monthly reviews specifically identifies ongoing Israeli interdiction operations against that corridor as the primary constraint on Hezbollah's rearmament right now. What the assassination of the IRGC naval officer who oversaw Iran's Hormuz blockade from the sea means for the strategic command that was running that operation. What the Israeli F-35I Adir is doing that no other aircraft on Earth can replicate in this environment. And in the strategic analysis section, what all of this means when you pull back far enough to see the full picture, because what is actually happening to Iran's proxy model right now, as assessed by the Belfer Center in their April 2026 paper, specifically on the degradation of that model, is something that 4 decades of American foreign policy failed to produce, and that the current military campaign has achieved in less than 6 months. The proxy network that Israel's fighter jets are currently dismantling was built over 40 years at a cost that dwarfs any conventional military investment Iran made in the same period. The structure is called the axis of resistance, and it functions as a distributed deterrence architecture. The logic behind it is elegant and predates any of the current commanders who are running it. If you cannot deter a militarily superior adversary with your own armed forces directly, you build a network of armed non-state actors across the region who can threaten your adversary's population centers, energy infrastructure, and allied states from multiple directions simultaneously. The cost of maintaining that network, measured in money and weapons, is a fraction of what it would cost to build a conventional military capable of matching your adversary head to head, and the deterrence value, measured in the number of times your adversary chooses not to strike you, because doing so would trigger responses from multiple directions. They cannot shut down simultaneously is enormous. The architecture is also designed with political deniability built into every layer. When the Houthis fire anti-ship missiles into the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran can claim it has no operational control over a Yemeni non-state actor. When the PMF attacks a U.S. base in Iraq, the government in Baghdad can claim it is working to control militias that exist outside formal military chains of command. When Hezbollah fires into northern Israel, Lebanon's government can profess inability to restrain a non-state military force embedded into its own territory. The distributed deniability was specifically engineered to make military responses politically costly without eliminating the actual threat. Hezbollah in Lebanon was the crown jewel, a force of an estimated 100,000 fighters at its peak, armed with over 150,000 rockets and missiles before the 2023 to 2024 war, capable of reaching every city in Israel, with an intelligence apparatus, a financial network, a social services empire that controls the political loyalty of half of Lebanon, and enough anti-tank missile capability to make any Israeli ground operation into its territory extraordinarily costly. The Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq are a coalition of roughly 67 armed factions with 238,000 registered fighters, and $5 billion in annual state funding now formally integrated into Iraqi law. The Houthis in Yemen control the Red Sea shipping lanes from the Bab al-Mandeb. Hamas controlled Gaza until October 2023. All of them receive Iranian weapons, Iranian training, Iranian strategic direction, and in many cases, Iranian personnel embedded directly in their command structures. All of them represent a different vector from which Iran can apply pressure without firing a single missile from Iranian territory. The IRGC Quds Force, the external operations arm of the IRGC, coordinates the entire architecture, providing weapons shipments, financial flows, intelligence sharing, and in some cases, direct combat command of proxy operations. The Quds Force and its network of commanders embedded in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen represent the connective tissue that makes the distributed system function as a coherent whole rather than as four separate unrelated conflicts. Dismantling the proxy model means dismantling both the arms of the network and the Quds Force infrastructure connecting them. This is what the Israeli Air Force and its American partners have been working to dismantle since February 28, 2026. Drop a like right now if you want to understand why this campaign is strategically different from everything that came before it, because the gap between what is publicly understood about these operations and what is actually happening on the ground across four countries simultaneously is enormous. Let's start with Lebanon and this strategic ambush that opened the Lebanon front in 2026. After the November 2024 ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel maintained near-daily strikes against Hezbollah personnel and infrastructure throughout southern Lebanon, accusing the group of attempting to rearm and rebuild at a pace faster than Israeli disruption operations could prevent. Two senior Israeli sources told CNN in March 2026 that Israel's leadership had concluded Hezbollah's military rehabilitation was progressing faster than the IDF's disruption efforts. The IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, framed the Lebanon campaign as an opportunity. What Israel needed was an opening to escalate to a level of military action that would genuinely finish the disarmament question rather than manage it indefinitely. Hezbollah provided that opening on March 2, 2026, when Israeli and American strikes killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei during Operation Epic Fury. Hezbollah fired 6 rockets into northern Israel as a response. Major General Milo called it a serious mistake. Israel was already positioned. The wave of strikes that followed targeted, in the IDF's description, senior Hezbollah operatives, command infrastructure, weapons depots, missile launchers, and military training facilities. The Al-Qard Al-Hassan financial institution, which functions as Hezbollah's banking system and is used to distribute salaries to fighters and manage the financial flows of the organization's extensive social services network, was struck in the coastal city of Tyre on the first day. Israeli ground forces invaded southern Lebanon, eventually controlling approximately 20% of Lebanese territory. By April of 2026, the Lebanese Ministry of Public Health was reporting more than 300 people killed and nearly 4,000 injured since March 2nd alone. More than 1 million Lebanese had been displaced northward past the Litani River. Israel issued dozens of forced evacuation warnings before strikes, ordering specific neighborhoods and villages to evacuate before hitting the military infrastructure embedded in those areas. The IDF specifically targeted and killed Hezbollah's chief explosives engineer, Abed Harb, the commander of Hezbollah's engineering unit, described as having been responsible for numerous attacks against IDF soldiers over decades, in a June 2026 strike. The same operation had already dismantled the factory network Harb managed, producing Hezbollah's concealed explosive devices, the kill wound and maim network that had been embedded across southern Lebanon. In another operation, the IDF killed 3 senior Hezbollah commanders simultaneously: Al-Haj Abbas Salami, a senior figure in Hezbollah's southern command, Raja Abbas Awache, a communications expert, and Ahmad Ali Hussein, who was responsible for strategic weapons development. These were not frontline fighters. These were the technical and command specialists who built and operated the weapons infrastructure that made Hezbollah capable of sustained precision warfare against Israeli military and civilian targets. In the 2023 to 2024 war, Israel had already killed Hassan Nasrallah and most of Hezbollah's senior military leadership. The strikes in 2026 were finishing the second tier of commanders in the technical infrastructure those commanders had been operating. The intelligence penetration visible in the targeting sequence, where the financial institution was hit on day 1, the engineering commander was killed after his entire network had been mapped, and 3 technical specialists were killed in a single operation, suggests a level of embedded access to Hezbollah's command structure that mirrors the operational intelligence that enabled the September 2024 pager attack, which detonated communications devices inside Hezbollah's network simultaneously across hundreds of members. By June 2026, a U.S. brokered framework had been presented that would condition any Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory on Hezbollah's disarmament. Hezbollah rejected it, but the military reality on the ground had already changed the strategic balance in ways that the political rejection of a ceasefire framework does not undo. An organization that enters a ceasefire negotiation having lost its Secretary General, most of its senior military leadership, its chief explosives engineer, its financial institution infrastructure, its weapons depots, significant portions of its tunnel system, and with the group that funds and arms it simultaneously fighting a war on multiple fronts and losing ground on all of them, is not the same Hezbollah that threatened Israel's civilian population with 150,000 rockets. The weapons smuggling route through Syria that Iran has used for a decade to keep Hezbollah's inventory stocked between rounds of fighting has been under near daily Israeli interdiction. The Alma Research and Education Center's July 2026 monthly review specifically notes that, as of that month, Iran is actively attempting to smuggle weapons to Hezbollah through Syria, but that Israeli operations are the primary constraint on those efforts. The pipeline is not closed, but it is severely congested. Now let's talk about Iraq, because what has happened to Iran's proxy network there between February and August 2026 represents a genuinely new phase in the history of American and Israeli military operations against the Islamic resistance in Iraq and the Popular Mobilization Forces more broadly. On March 1st and 2nd, 2026, the United States and Israel conducted several attacks on Iranian-backed Iraqi militias described as designed to degrade their military capabilities. On March 4th, Kataib Hezbollah commander Abu Hassan al-Fariji was killed by an airstrike targeting his location specifically. Kataib Hezbollah is not a minor faction. It has been one of the most operationally active components of the Islamic resistance in Iraq, carrying out drone and rocket attacks against U.S. forces at dozens of bases across Iraq and Syria since October 2023. And its commanders operate with a level of Iranian direction that makes distinguishing between IRGC Quds Force operations and Kataib Hezbollah operations essentially a distinction without a difference at the operational level. On March 11th, a strike on a PMF building at Akashat killed 20 militiamen and civilians. By April 7th, 2026, the Iraqi government had formally tabulated what CENTCOM had done in Iraq since the start of the conflict. 138 attacks, resulting in the deaths of 73 PMF members, 10 Iraqi army soldiers, 3 Iraqi federal police officers, and 6 civilians. 138 attacks inside Iraqi territory in roughly 5 weeks. The Iraqi National Security Council condemned the strikes as a highly dangerous escalation, a violation of Iraq's sovereignty, and an attack on its official security institutions, which is the expected diplomatic response from a government that has formally integrated the very militia groups being struck into its own state security apparatus. The political tension between Baghdad and Washington is real and significant, and it constrains what the full operational picture of Iraqi militia degradation can achieve. Iraq's PMF chiefs have openly mocked the government's call to restrict weapons to state control. Abu Fadak al-Mohammadawi, the PMF chief of staff, appeared in a video circulating online and declared that whoever takes the weapon, man, let him take it. The militias that Iran funds and directs within the PMF umbrella have no intention of disarming under political pressure alone, and they have demonstrated in their response to the strikes that they intend to continue operations regardless of what the Iraqi government formally agrees to with Washington. That is the constraint. It is real. But it is also the constraint that the July 29th joint U.S.-Saudi strikes were specifically designed to address by raising the cost of continued operations to a level that political pressure alone cannot reach. That is, when Saudi Arabia entered the picture in a way that has received far less attention than it deserves. On July 29th, 2026, the United States and Saudi Arabia launched joint airstrikes targeting PMF facilities across Iraq, hitting sites in Baghdad and 5 to 7 provinces, depending on the source. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense confirmed the strikes, calling them limited, targeted strikes against Iranian-backed militias responsible for attacks on Saudi oil facilities. CENTCOM confirmed coordination. The PMF confirmed at least 20 of its members killed and 32 wounded in the preliminary toll. Saudi Arabia striking inside Iraqi territory in coordination with the United States against Iranian-backed militias is an event with no parallel in the recent history of this region. Riyadh has spent years carefully managing its public posture toward Iran and its proxies, preferring economic pressure and covert action to openly acknowledged military strikes. Press reports had revealed earlier in the war that Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been conducting secret strikes against Iranian targets. July 29th made the Saudi role explicit, public, and operationally confirmed. The strikes specifically targeted logistics and weapon sites used by the militias to launch drone and missile attacks against Saudi energy infrastructure, including Aramco's Abqaiq crude processing facility, the single largest oil processing installation in the kingdom, and a 400,000 barrel per day facility that Iranian-directed militia attacks had partially forced offline. Iran had been employing Iraqi militias to attack Aramco facilities as a strategy of low-signature deterrence, keeping Tehran's fingerprints off attacks on Saudi economic infrastructure, while still applying pressure through the same proxy architecture. July 29th changed that calculation by demonstrating that Saudi Arabia was willing to strike inside Iraqi territory in response, absorbing the political cost of doing so, and accepting that the transparent coordination with the United States meant the action could not be attributed to anyone but Riyadh. The proxy shield of deniability failed when Saudi Arabia decided the economic cost of drone attacks on Aramco exceeded the political cost of striking the people who launched them. Subscribe right now if you have not already, because this is the analysis that connects the dots between what is happening in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and the Strait of Hormuz simultaneously, and you need to be here for every development. There's one assassination that deserves specific attention because it strikes directly at the command layer that was running Iran's maritime operations, and nobody has connected it to the broader proxy campaign with the clarity it deserves. Israeli intelligence services assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the IRGC naval officer who was overseeing the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz on behalf of the IRGC. Tangsiri was not a figurehead. He was the operational commander of the IRGC Navy's campaign against commercial shipping, the person responsible for coordinating the fast attack boat swarms, the anti-ship missile systems, and the maritime drone operations that had been the primary instrument of Iran's strait harassment strategy for years, killing the operational commander of Iran's maritime campaign while simultaneously running a naval blockade of Iranian ports and a sustained air campaign against coastal surveillance and missile infrastructure, is not three separate operations. It is a single integrated campaign targeting the people, the equipment, and the communications network of the maritime threat simultaneously. The IRGC had to replace Tangsiri with new leadership in the middle of an active conflict, without intact communications infrastructure, with a fast attack boat fleet significantly reduced by the July 11th strike that destroyed more than 60 vessels in a single package. The institutional disruption of losing the operational commander of your most active campaign while also losing the surveillance systems he used to generate targeting solutions is the kind of compounding damage that is difficult to quantify from the outside, but is catastrophic from the inside. Now, let's talk about the platform that has been doing work in this campaign that no other aircraft in any air force anywhere could replicate. The Israeli F-35I Adir is the Israeli-modified variant of the F-35I Joint Strike Fighter, customized with Israeli-developed avionics, electronic warfare systems, and weapons integration that the United States does not fly in any other version of the platform. The modifications Israel made to the standard F-35A are classified in their specifics, but Israeli defense reporting has consistently indicated they include enhanced electronic warfare capabilities, integration with Israeli-developed standoff munitions that the standard F-35A cannot carry in its internal bay configuration, and avionics updates developed from Israeli operational experience that have been feeding back into the aircraft's capability envelope in ways that cannot be replicated by an operator who has not been flying the platform operationally against real threats. The F-35I's combination of low radar cross-section, integrated electronic warfare that can detect and jam radar emitters before those emitters can generate a targeting solution, the ability to carry a diverse weapons payload internally without breaking its stealth profile, and the sensor fusion system that allows the pilot to see through the skin of the aircraft through multiple layered sensor feeds, makes it uniquely capable of operating in exactly the contested environment that Iran's remaining air defense network represents. The distributed aperture system on the F-35, which allows the pilot to look through the airframe in any direction using 6 infrared cameras mounted around the aircraft's body, is the kind of situational awareness that changes what a single pilot can perceive and process while flying at speed in a high-threat environment. It is not an incremental improvement over fourth-generation capabilities. It is a different category of sensor integration. Israeli F-35I Adirs have been photographed taking off for strikes in Iran directly, with an image released by the IDF on March 4th, 2026, and another published by the Times of Israel on March 7th, 2026, showing an F-35I lifting off for a strike mission in Iran, marking a public confirmation that Israel's most advanced combat aircraft is operating in the most defended airspace in the region and producing results. In Lebanon, where Hezbollah's anti-aircraft capabilities include Russian-supplied anti-aircraft systems, and where the terrain creates radar masking opportunities that make low-altitude penetration by fourth-generation fighters risky, the F-35I's stealth profile and sensor suite allow it to prosecute targets that other aircraft would need CAD packages and Wild Weasel support to even approach. In Iraq, where the political complexity of striking inside a sovereign state requires rapid, precise, hard-to-attribute kinetic action, the F-35I is uniquely suited. The U.S. State Department used emergency authority to bypass congressional review for a $650 million bomb sale to Israel, covering more than 20,000 munitions during the conflict. Secretary Rubio personally determined that an emergency existed requiring immediate delivery, waiving the standard 30-day congressional review period. The combination of a platform that can reach the most defended targets and a munitions resupply pipeline, backed by an emergency determination that keeps those weapons flowing, is the operational foundation of everything the IDF has been executing. Here's the honest picture of what Iran's proxy network still has, because the accurate assessment is always the useful one, and the honest picture is the one that actually helps you understand where this goes. The Belfer Center paper was explicit that the degradation is real, but that restoration is possible if the pressure is removed before the network's institutional capacity to rebuild is permanently damaged. That is the race Iran is trying to run. Hold on long enough for American political will to fracture, use the ceasefire windows to reconstitute, and return to the same posture from a baseline that is lower than before but not eliminated. Hezbollah has been severely degraded but not dismantled. Hezbollah has been severely degraded but not dismantled. The organization still exists and still commands loyalty across significant portions of the Lebanese Shia community. It still commands loyalty across significant portions of the Lebanese Shia community. It still has fighters who have not been killed and who are engaging Israeli ground forces in southern Lebanon on a daily basis. It still receives weapons shipments through the Syrian corridor, though at reduced volume compared to pre-conflict levels. The popular mobilization forces in Iraq still have 238,000 registered fighters and formal integration into Iraqi law that makes their complete elimination a legal and political impossibility in the short term without a fundamental change in Iraqi governance. The joint U.S.-Saudi strikes killed 20 PMF fighters across 7 provinces. The PMF has 238,000 registered fighters. The strikes are imposing real costs, but they are not eliminating the organization. The Houthis in Yemen have opened a second front on Saudi oil infrastructure and continue to threaten the Red Sea shipping lanes, giving Iran a geographic diversification of its proxy pressure that the current air campaign has not resolved. The Alma Research Center's July 2026 monthly review specifically notes that Iran is continuing to employ Iraqi militias to attack Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia as a strategy of low-signature deterrence designed to apply pressure on the Trump administration while maintaining plausible distance from direct responsibility for the attacks. The proxy model is being degraded. It has not collapsed. What the Belfer Center's April 2026 paper on the degradation of Iran's proxy model documented is the cumulative picture up to that point, and the picture has only accelerated since. The dissolution of the Syrian Democratic Forces in January 2026 significantly constrained PMF maneuverability by bringing the Syrian Arab Army to the Iraq-Syria border, reducing the geographic space Iran's proxies had used to move between the two countries. Arab tribes in northeastern Syria had increasingly aligned with the Syrian government, reducing the space for Iranian and PMF influence and narrowing the strategic depth of Iran's Iraqi proxy network. PMF factions like the Badr organization and Asaib al-Haq had actively avoided backing attacks on Israel and U.S. targets, fracturing the unified front that the axis of resistance required. Some units of the PMF have agreed to disarm under the framework presented by Iraqi Prime Minister al-Zaidi following his White House visit, with a September 30th deadline to restrict weapons to state control and a withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from Iraq on that same date, leaving only the Erbil base as a forward hub for Syria operations and continuous surveillance of Iran. The Houthis, by 2026, had redirected most of their focus back to Yemen rather than toward the Israeli front, after their own infrastructure and leadership had absorbed significant American strikes throughout 2024 and 2025. The structural conditions that made Iran's proxy model effective, coordinated action from multiple simultaneously active proxy forces against a single adversary, are breaking down under the weight of sustained military pressure from an unprecedented coalition of actors. Iran responded to IRGC advisor deaths in the July 29th joint U.S.-Saudi strikes by firing ballistic missiles at American bases in Jordan later that same day, which then triggered another round of American retaliatory strikes on IRGC targets in southwestern Iran. The escalation cycle is still running, but the trajectory of the proxy network's capability compared to its state in October of 2023, when it was arguably at its peak coordination and operational tempo, is downward across every metric that matters. Hezbollah has lost most of its senior leadership across 2 rounds of war. The PMF has lost hundreds of fighters and dozens of commanders across 138 American strikes in Iraq. The Houthis have absorbed strikes on their leadership and infrastructure continuously. Hamas in Gaza has been militarily dismantled as an organized fighting force. The Syria corridor for weapons smuggling to Hezbollah is actively interdicted by the most capable stealth strike aircraft operating in the region today. And the IRGC Quds Force personnel embedded in these proxy structures are now priority targets for both American and Israeli intelligence and strike operations in ways they have never been before. The proxy model is being degraded. It has not collapsed. But what is happening to it right now is measurably, verifiably different from every previous engagement with it. And the Israeli fighter jets that have been reaching targets from Tehran to Beirut to Baghdad in the same campaign are the sharpest instrument of that degradation. Here is the strategic analysis that ties everything together and explains why this moment is different from every previous American and Israeli engagement with Iran's proxy network. Every previous campaign targeted individual proxies sequentially. You would strike Hezbollah in Lebanon and let the other arms of the network continue operating. You would hit the Houthis in Yemen and avoid the PMF in Iraq. You would sanction the IRGC and not touch its Lebanese financial institution entire. The segmented approach was driven by political constraints, escalation concerns, and the fear of creating a unified response from all arms of the network simultaneously. What has changed in 2026 is that all of those constraints were removed at once by the scale of the conflict. When the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury in late February 2026, every arm of the axis of resistance understood that the foundational structure that funded, armed, and directed them was under existential military pressure. The IRGC's command infrastructure, the revenue streams from the Strait, the nuclear program, and the supreme leadership itself were all being targeted simultaneously. That pressure forced the network to respond, and in responding, it gave Israel and the United States the justification to attack the full proxy architecture rather than just the direct Iranian military. Hezbollah firing rockets into northern Israel on March 2nd was the strategic mistake that made the Lebanon front possible. The PMF attacking Saudi Aramco facilities and U.S. troops in Jordan was the justification for joint U.S.-Saudi strikes inside Iraq. The Houthi strikes on Saudi tankers in the Red Sea are providing the framework for an expanding operational mandate against the southern arm of the network. Iran built the axis of resistance to be so distributed and so embedded in sovereign state structures that attacking it would be politically impossible. What the current campaign is demonstrating is that when you create a conflict large enough to override those political constraints, the distributed nature of the network becomes a weakness, not a strength. There is no place for weapons to hide that Israeli fighter jets cannot reach, no commander safe enough that Israeli intelligence cannot locate, no financial institution embedded deeply enough in civilian infrastructure that a precision-guided munition cannot target after issuing an evacuation warning. The strategic ambush that Major General Milo described in Lebanon on March 2nd was not just a tactical event in southern Lebanon. It was the template for a campaign that is simultaneously operating across 4 countries against the most expensive and carefully constructed proxy network in the history of modern warfare. And it is working. Drop a comment below and tell me which front of this campaign you think gets the least coverage and deserves the most analysis, because the community that watches this takes this seriously at a level that most mainstream coverage does not. Is it the Iraq front and the joint U.S.-Saudi strikes that opened a completely new chapter in Riyadh's relationship with the Iranian proxy problem? Is it the Syria weapons corridor and the near-daily Israeli interdiction operations that are throttling Hezbollah's rearmament? Is it the Lebanon ground operation and what it means for the long-term political structure of that country? Is it the F-35I's specific role in operations that no other platform could execute? Or is it the broader question of what happens to the axis of resistance's deterrence value when every arm of it is being struck simultaneously and the organization that pays for all of it is losing its revenue streams, its nuclear program, and its ability to threaten the Strait? Subscribe if you have not already, because every development in this campaign across every theater, every proxy front, every platform, and every political dimension is going to be analyzed here with the depth and honesty this extraordinary moment demands.